Welcome to the Bar Exam Toolbox podcast. Today we are talking about creating great bar exam study habits. Your Bar Exam Toolbox hosts are Alison Monahan and Lee Burgess. That's me. We are here to demystify the bar exam experience so you can study effectively, stay sane, and hopefully pass and move on with your life. We're the co-creators of the Law School Toolbox, the Bar Exam Toolbox, and the career-related website Career Dicta. Alison also runs the Girls Guide to Law School. If you enjoy the show, please leave a review on your favorite listening app and check out our sister podcast, the Law School Toolbox podcast. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can reach us via the contact form on barexamtoolbox.com, and we'd love to hear from you. And with that, let's get started.
Welcome back to the Bar Exam Toolbox podcast. Today, we're talking about creating great bar exam study habits.
I know, super fun. I just love talking about this stuff. I think we might love talking about this stuff more than anyone else I know.
I think that is entirely possible. Well, and also, Lee, you've been reading some books on this, so I know that you're going to drop some knowledge on us.
I'm going to try. Yes, I have been reading a lot of books on this, which makes me a super fun party guest to talk about what I've been working on at work. You know, I've been thinking about habits as how to apply it to the bar exam study situation. And I've been thinking about it in two categories. So I thought that was the way we can kind of frame our discussion today.
Sure.
The first one is really to focus on habits for studying, optimizing your studying, and then habits for life, which is outside of studying. And I think what happens in the bar space is often we focus on one or the other, but not both together. And really you need to kind of optimize both of these parts of your life to be effective at your bar study time. What do you think about that?
I think that's right. We see people doing all kinds of stuff that is counterproductive outside of their bar study. And then we see people doing all kinds of stuff that is counterproductive inside of the bar study. So I do think if you think about for the task I have to do every day, which is study for the bar, there are probably certain things you need to do habitually there. But then also just things like, how are you going to get food? If you have a dog, like how are you going to walk the dog? Are you going to have some exercise? You're going to get outside every day. You know, all of these are habits that I think can really cause a breakdown in the study if you don't pay attention to those.
Yeah, I 100% agree. So one of the books I've been reading is called Hidden Potential, which is Adam Grant's new book. It's a great book, and I'm going to talk about many parts of it over time on this podcast. But the part that was a bit of a wow moment for me was that in this book, he really does talk about learning. And of course, I listen to this sort of stuff, and all I can do is apply it to what we do. So I'm like, oh, we have to talk about this.
Fair.
So he had some great ideas about this idea of learning. And he started talking about learning as like traveling great distances requires the courage to seek out the right kind of discomfort, the capacity to absorb the right information, and the will to accept the right imperfections. And I really feel like he is introducing this idea of if you really want to learn something, you need to be uncomfortable, you need to do the heavy lifting, and it may not be by doing the activities that make you feel good. And we have been talking about this for years, this idea of you need to be uncomfortable, but it was pretty cool to see some science and research behind it and not just us talking about what we'd seen work with our students.
That is very validating that Adam Grant thinks that this is also correct, because we have a great post about doing the things that make you uncomfortable. And I think that is absolutely true. It's funny, I was at a ski class this morning with some other ski instructors, and we were doing this exercise, and I came down, I'm like, that felt really weird. Did anyone see that? Like, I looked really weird. Like, I felt like my shoulders were doing this weird thing. And one of the other guys was like, well, when you're taking the class, it's probably going to feel awkward and sort of uncomfortable. And I was like, oh, right. Yes. He's like, if it feels the same, you're probably not learning anything.
That's a very good point. The other point that he made, which I found interesting, was this idea that the way you like to learn isn't exactly the way you learn best. And this just was such an aha moment, because how many times have we heard this from students, both in the law school and bar space, this idea of like, well, I like to listen to lectures, or I like to do this activity. And when you're avoiding unpleasant activities, you're really not getting where you want to go. Which I think is a great truism of life pretty much, but applied to the bar exam space is a very powerful idea.
Yeah, I think this is so interesting. So I was talking to Gabe Tenenbaum on a different podcast about this sort of topic of learning styles. And he says, I believe I have a preferred learning style, but I've also seen the research and I know that that is not accurate. And I completely agree with him. I'm like, I know. I'm such a visual person. Like I need it. But you know what? The research shows that might not be the best single way for me to approach this. So I think this whole idea of like getting comfortable with the discomfort is so critical for bar study. We talk to a lot of people who unfortunately do not pass in the end. And so many times they say, well, I was kind of doing things that felt like maybe they weren't really helping me, but I kept doing them because they were on the schedule. And a lot of this, let's be honest, is sitting and watching videos. So that might feel comfortable. It might feel like, oh, I'm being really productive. But the reality is I would say basically everyone, that is not the most efficient and best way to prepare for this exam exclusively, certainly.
I know. And Adam Grant had some science to back up that point exactly. So
perfect.
Yes, cue that. So he was talking about learning styles and the fact that what we assume to know about learning styles, there's not a lot of science behind it. Instead, he was encouraging us to think about finding the right kind of learning for an individual task. He actually talked about some research that was done where they had a scientific study or a scientific article, and they had a group of folks that they lectured to about the article, the facts in the article. And then they had a group where they read the article. And here's going to be the sad news for most people listening to this podcast. The people who listened to the article, they liked it. They really enjoyed the experience. The people who read the article didn't enjoy it. But then when they did an assessment after the fact, unfortunately for everyone listening to hours and hours of lectures, the students that only listened got 59% on the quiz, and the folks that read the material got 81%. It's been a while since I did statistics when I was a psych major, but I feel like that's a significant difference.
Yeah, I was a sociology major, and I'm like, that's pretty significant. You don't see like 20 plus difference on something like that all that frequently. That's pretty big.
I know. And you can say that maybe sometimes outcomes would be different for individual people, but this idea is something I think bar studiers really need to think about when they talk about their best bar exam study habits. If you are passively listening to lectures, and I think the passive nature of the listening is probably one of the things, in my opinion, that would probably drive this outcome, that it can be more entertaining to listen to things. I mean, a lot of people listen to this podcast and think it's entertaining, right? But if you're trying to retain information, that may not be the best way. So you need to start evaluating your activities and seeing if this same effect, I mean, you could do this type of a study on yourself.
True.
During one morning.
Very true.
You could spend an hour listening to a lecture on one subject. You could spend an hour reviewing outlines and then quiz yourself, see what happens. You might find similar outcomes. I don't know. It could be an interesting exercise.
I completely agree with that. I feel validated by this because I decided before I started bar prep that lectures were going to be inefficient for me. So I only read outlines. And I just really did feel like I could get through that material and retain it so much faster if I sat down and spent 2 to 3 hours, like really focusing on reading an outline on a topic I'd never studied, making some notes, and then doing some practice versus having somebody lecture at me. It is interesting to me, the pedagogy that has developed around how the majority of people are told to prepare for this exam. And I think you see with studies like this, it might just not be the best way.
Yeah. And then you do see that the companies are trying to sort of repackage what they're doing. So some will say, but the lectures are in 15-minute chunks, not 2-hour chunks. And I'm like,
right,
but
and you're filling in the blanks.
Right. It's still a passive audio lecture. As much as we would like to reframe it, it's just edited content. So, it is what it is. But I think if you are sitting there saying, I don't know, Lee, I don't buy it. I mean, Adam Grant's a pretty smart guy, so I pretty much believe what's in most of his books. But try it on yourself. Why not? It'd be an experiment you could do in a couple of hours. And I think that there could be some really powerful information for you moving forward.
I 100% agree. Everybody is different and people learn differently and have different preferences. You've got to kind of test this out and see early on, is this the best way for you to prepare, until you keep doing it for 8 to 10 weeks. And then you get to the end and you don't pass, and then you have to do it all again. Like,
I
that's
know.
not a scenario we want you to be in. We want you to be like optimizing your study habits early in this process. I mean, you could even do this if you're listening to this as a 3L. You could even do this semester. You could like literally take some material that you've never seen before, watch a video on it, listen to something on it, read it, and see which one seems to work best. Go ahead and just do that.
Like, let's say you're studying for the MPRE,
True.
which is a test most 3Ls are going to sit for. There's not such a huge volume of information. You could really do a side-by-side challenge for yourself. Take part of the outline and read it, listen to part of a lecture, and see what you retain more. That's going to be huge information. It's going to really influence how you spend your time on bar prep. And we just really love this idea of optimizing, because who has time to waste? I definitely don't. I know you don't, Alison, either. So we want you to get the most bang for your buck.
Well, and imagine if you could just read something instead of watching a lecture on it and be 20% better.
Yeah. I mean,
Like,
it's
that's
really
huge.
crazy.
I mean, most people aren't failing by that many points. We talk to people all the time who are like, they're pretty close. They're 5% away. They're 10% away. Like 20% off is actually a pretty big deficit.
Yeah. But even let's take me working on this podcast. So I consume a lot of books via audiobook because that is how I have some extra time. And so I listened to this book. It's quite a good audiobook if anyone wants to listen to it. But then I knew that I wanted to talk about it with some sort of like thoughtful authority. And so I had to buy the hardcover book. And then I sat with my notepad and I took notes about this. I flipped through it to remind myself about the parts that were the most impactful. So all I really retained from the audiobook was, oh my gosh, there's some great information about this. And I remember that there was a study, but I couldn't have told you that it was a 20% difference. Like, a lot of these details had slipped my mind when I was driving and listening to something versus sitting with the hardcover book. And I was like, I'm going through the book and taking notes, and my retention of what was in these chapters is so much higher. I mean, it really is very different.
I think you see this across the board. I mean, you can think about like learning foreign languages. You can't just read it. You can't just listen to it. You have to actually do it.
Oh, yes. And he talks about that too. So he says that when folks are trying to study a foreign language, that students are more adept at understanding and speaking a new language when they were taught to produce it and not just comprehend it. And I find this almost every day because I am on, let me check, a 47-day streak of Duolingo. Ooh. Thank you very much. If you listen to our Law School Toolbox podcast on habits from January, you knew that this was one of my habits that I was going to try and do this year. So I definitely notice the difference when I'm just recognizing words instead of forced to produce them. I make many more mistakes when I have to produce words than I need to recognize them. So it was no shock. Yeah, it was no shock to me that he said that if you don't practice producing something, you're not really going to comprehend and learn it. And again, that made me think about bar prep, because so often students really push back on practicing, having to come up with analysis to try and regurgitate law. They just want to do practice open book. They don't want to test themselves. And based on this book and what we have seen in our work, that is just not going to get you there, unfortunately.
No, it's not. I think you can use sort of a training wheels approach in the beginning. Like, I'd rather have somebody in the very beginning of their bar prep do practice open book, but do the practice versus only consuming information and saying what people always tell us is, well, I can't really do the practice until I've learned more law. Because you never feel like you have enough law. Right. Nobody walks into the bar exam thinking, oh, I have perfect retention of every piece of law that could be tested. So if you're waiting to get to that point, you're never going to start practicing. So you can start with kind of the training wheels of, okay, I'm going to do what I can. And then if I get to a point where I can't, then I'll look something up and then I'll continue. That's fine for a few weeks. But you then have to transition out of that. So you got to keep upping the difficulty level, basically. You've got to keep making yourself do those uncomfortable things because you will get comfortable doing an open book essay. Like, you should get comfortable doing that eventually. That's the whole point. But that's not the exam.
Yeah. Well, and I think what we've done with our Writing of the Week program, this idea that you can get the law and like do a review of the law and then practice applying it. I even think that is a great stepping stone. You know, take
True.
a few minutes and review the law that you're going to need to apply, but then still try and test yourself and see if you can regurgitate it after a short study session, because making those mistakes and then going back and figuring out what you did wrong, that is a method of learning too. So I think there's almost a middle ground between an open book. It's like partial open book because you're still testing yourself. And you're going to get the benefit of making mistakes and relearning something.
Right, because there's data or science that your brain, when you make a mistake and notice it, it actually becomes interested. It's like, oh, that was not what I was expecting. I wrote that rule down incorrectly. Huh.
Right.
And that's actually what makes you start retaining that information more than just copying it correctly into an essay and pretending that you know the rule.
I know. So there's really interesting stuff in this book. I highly recommend it when you have some downtime. We're going to talk probably about more of the things that I read in this book, but this specific issue just fit so nicely in what we wanted to talk today. I do want to make a few other takeaways because I thought he so eloquently kind of captured this struggle. He is saying that practicing before mastery is uncomfortable but necessary, although many of us avoid it. He says accelerated learning requires a second form of courage, being brave enough to use your knowledge as you acquire it. And I just loved that idea that it's kind of an act of bravery to force yourself to do something that's very hard and allow yourself to make mistakes.
Oh, I love that. That's a great quote. We should post that on everyone's desk. Basically.
I know. I'm like, I got to work that into some email that I send to our students because it really shows that it does take courage to make mistakes. It really does. It doesn't feel great.
No, it doesn't. And, law students and people studying for the bar often are perfectionists. We like to get everything right. And this is not that situation. You're going to be on the struggle bus for a while with this. But if you don't go through that process, you're going to find yourself at the end with basically a lot of legal information crammed into your head. And then you're there on test day being like, oh my gosh, what do I do?
What do I do now?
We see the score reports. We talk to people. It doesn't end well usually.
No. So when you have some free time, Hidden Potential by Adam Grant, totally worth it. Good audiobook, but you'll retain more if you read it. Lessons learned. All right, now let's move on to Habits for Life, which is also something we absolutely love to talk about. We recently talked about this on the Law School Toolbox as our New Year New Habits episode. So I've got to bring up something I brought up there, which was an article I read about Ryan Serhant from the show $1 Million Listing New York. And yes, I watch reality TV and I find it a great way to decompress in the evenings. I'm sorry to admit it. Anyway, it happens. It's okay. But he has been used because he built a very successful real estate brokerage from the ground up, like starting during COVID. And so they were using him as a case study at Harvard Business School. And one of the things that they talk about in this article was his kind of extreme time management. And he talks about looking at the day as having a certain number of minutes. So there are 1,440 minutes in a day, and you do need to sleep. Sleeping 8 hours, which most of us, I don't know, I don't sleep 8 hours, but I know we're supposed to. Sleeping 8 hours is about 480 minutes. So you have approximately 960 other minutes left in each day. And so he said that when he started thinking about how he spent his time, he started to do very detailed time tracking, which is something that we have talked about, especially for law students to do, to see where all of his minutes were going. And what resulted is what he calls the 1,000-minute rule, because clearly this guy does not sleep 8 hours a day. He gets up at like 4:30 in the morning. But the premise is that we all have the same number of minutes as everyone else in the world, and we get to use them as we choose. And it's like having a time budget every day, because he really focuses on time as a scarce resource that is precious and you can't earn any more of it. So you have to decide what to do with what you have. And this idea is linked to something that Eve Rodsky, who we've had on the Law School Toolbox podcast a few times, who I also love her work, read her books, listen to her audiobooks. She's a lawyer turned author. And she talks about time, especially women's time, as being treated like sand, which is this idea that time is infinite when it should be treated like diamonds, which are a precious resource, although now we can do lab diamonds. So maybe that analogy isn't like going to work forever. And I think this idea of time tracking is really interesting, especially when it comes to bar prep, because one of the things we hear so much from folks is that they do not have time to study. And it's almost like a powerless admission. It's like, I just don't have time.
Right. Or I don't have time. I don't have time to practice. I don't have time to do X, Y, and Z thing that I know I should be doing. Everything is just taking so long.
Mm-hmm. And so it really opens up this question of like, what do you want or need to spend your 1,000 minutes on? And 1,000 minutes sounds kind of like a long time. When you said it out that way, I was like, oh, it's a lot of minutes. So I think it's a really good exercise for anyone, whether or not you're in the midst of bar prep or not, to sit down and just ask yourself, what do you want to be spending time on? How much time do you want to dedicate to studying? How much time do you want to dedicate to taking care of your body, to cooking good food, to spending time with friends and loved ones, to go walking outside with your dog, to care for a family member that needs something? I mean, you can really make this list and then see how you're allocating your time. And think about it. Is social media going to be on that list? Like, how many hours a day do we spend looking at Instagram? Maybe.
It pains me that you say hours a day, but I know that is the reality. I'm thinking, 20 minutes a day might be reasonable on Instagram. And I guarantee you I spend more time on social media every single day than that.
Yeah, I know. I think that's why these exercises of time tracking can be so powerful, especially during times of intense pressure or when you're feeling incredibly busy. And I think everyone feels that way during bar prep. We've talked about it as, treating it like a job, but I think this goes a step further because you're really consciously kind of acknowledging to yourself how you want to use your precious 1,000 minutes. It doesn't mean that you should enjoy every 1,000 minutes of your day. You should do hard things, but you should be intentional about how you're spending your time, because I do think that it leads to better outcomes and also more satisfaction.
Right. I think with people who are preparing for the bar, it's really important to track what you think you're going to be able to get done in a certain time frame versus what you actually are able to get done. And so there are a lot of different ways that you can structure your day. We typically suggest probably setting up your schedule for one day the night before, because those are kind of separate tasks. The task of like, what am I going to try to get done tomorrow versus the task of actually doing it. So you might sit down with your schedule the night before. You might look at it and say, okay, maybe you have 7 hours total that you think you can devote to bar prep. Well, don't just go to bed at that point. Basically break those down into 45-minute chunks, 50-minute chunks, whatever it is that you're going to actually apply a task to, because that's going to let you start to see, okay, I thought I was going to do 10 MBE questions in this amount of time, but I actually see that I only got 8 done or 6 done or 5 done. So you want to be calibrating every day when you're planning based on this information. What is the point of just pretending you're going to get 10 done the next day? That's probably not going to happen either. And the day after that. And then you're just falling further and further behind and you're feeling bad about yourself, where you need to take that step back and say, okay, that clearly wasn't the right guess on what the time this was going to take. What do I need to do differently? There's just no point in kind of setting yourself up every single day for failure by doing things that aren't realistic for you.
100%. And I think when you are attacking a goal, such as studying for the bar, it's okay to say, I'm going to allocate this percentage of my day to this goal, but then I'm going to give myself the freedom to do these other things outside of that.
Exactly.
And then you create that to-do list and you optimize it. I was having a call with someone who has been a practicing attorney for a number of years and is considering coming back to sit for the bar in California. We were talking about the 400-hour rule, which is it takes most people around 400 hours to study for the bar. And she's saying, how much do I have to study? And I was like, well, we can start with 400 hours. And then you could tell she was kind of like, 400 hours? And I'm like, well, if we break that down by a number of weeks, that could be like 25 hours a week. And then you could tell she's like, do I want to do 25 hours a week?
Right.
Like I feel the hesitation, but there's some honesty that comes out of looking at it this way. Do you want to spend 25 hours a week on a goal? Again, it doesn't mean that it's going to be the most fun 25 hours a week, but if that's what it's going to take, you have to ask yourself, is that how I want to spend my time? And if it is, then optimize it.
Yeah, I think that's part of the thing. Are you really going to commit to this? Because if you are going to commit to it, just commit and do the best you can. And like nobody's perfect. Every day is not going to go perfectly. You're not always going to do every single thing you set out to do. And that's fine. If you're doing 80% of what you really need to be doing and that stuff that's going to get you closer to passing on a daily basis, you're going to be pretty good by the end, probably, if you're doing that consistently. One missing essay is not going to make you fail the bar, but kind of screwing around all day long and pretending to study and doing nothing is actually what's not going to let you pass. I think it's a hard balance because people get really obsessed with studying just all the time and let all this other stuff go by the wayside, and that's not great.
No.
Or they're just kind of like spinning their wheels and not really using the time productively and not getting stuff done and getting frustrated. And that's not great either. You've got to find this middle ground.
And I think in the habit world, people talk about this as really the cumulative effect of small change.
Exactly.
And so if you're going to do maybe the same 7 hours as you did yesterday, but you're going to optimize it and you really get 5% more done that day than the day before, but you do that for the next 45 days, that's really going to shift things. And you do need to keep that mindset with your bar prep. It is really the cumulative effect of all of those weeks of studying. It's not just about the one day. It's how the one day adds to the stack of that 400 hours.
Right, or even something like memorization. It's just incredible that you read about or hear about spaced repetition. We've got podcasts on this. 10 minutes a day if you do this consistently, and you will have 90% retention of the information you're studying at the end of like a 10-week period. So if your habit is the first thing I do when I wake up is I do 10 minutes of spaced repetition memorization, that's going to be crazy impactful by the end. But like on an every daily basis, you're going to feel like you're doing very little.
Yeah, it's that consistency of time after time. And I think we often don't focus on consistency when we talk about studying for exams. And the science is really showing us that consistency is key. And then going back to what we were just talking about, then making yourself be uncomfortable and produce that information. So it's like you do that spaced repetition and then you challenge yourself to write it down or apply it to fact patterns, take that next step.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like we said, it's not enough just to have the information in your head. You have to have actually worked with it. And that is the piece that is so hard to convince so many people of.
Yeah. So what if you are still struggling with your study habits? What are some other things that you can try to get yourself back on track? So really, my other favorite thing to talk about is distraction. So stop multitasking because we literally cannot multitask. Even though we love to think we can, we're really bad at it. And the internet distractions, the phone distractions, the pings on your watch, the pings on your computer, all of that is going to cognitively make it much more difficult to focus. And you have to figure out how to minimize distractions. So I think this is like number one thing to try if you are having a hard time focusing. Put your phone on Do Not Disturb, take off your Apple Watch, turn off your internet, and study.
Right. And, think about where you're studying. Like right now, for example, I'm looking out a window and there are a couple of flies flying around and it's very distracting to me because I'm thinking about, am I going to be able to kill those flies later? Can I just get them outside? How am I going to get them outside? This is what's running through my head instead of focusing on what I'm doing. So if I were facing a wall, I wouldn't know the flies were there. I would deal with them later. So I think just this basic step of, what does your study place look like? What does your system look like? Do you have your materials organized? So if you're studying a particular topic, you can just reach and get that topic and go to work. Or is it total chaos? If you spend 5 minutes at the end of a day cleaning up your space and getting ready for the next day, you're going to set yourself up for so much more success than if you're living in a chaotic situation. You can't find anything and you can't do your work.
Yeah, 100%. I also think it's important to create some sort of accountability for yourself. Some people can be accountable to themselves or their to-do list, but some folks need outside accountability. So that could be a study buddy. It doesn't even have to be somebody that you necessarily are studying for the bar with. It can just be someone that you report back to. It can be journaling. If you don't want to talk to anybody about it, you can journal and have accountability to that. It can be an electronic accountability. There's something called the Forest app, which allows you to kind of set this app to help you focus for periods of time, and then it electronically grows trees, and then you win like coins and you can then deposit the coins, and then they will go plant trees. It's like a whole thing. I don't remember. I think I actually saw it discussed on Instagram, which is funny. But then I went and looked it up, and I was like, oh, this is kind of cute. And then if you interrupt yourself on your forest app, the tree dies.
Oh no.
Yeah.
That could be very motivating for the right people.
I know, right? So there are these things you can do to kind of set up reward systems for yourself or create accountability. And it's no judgment if you need it. Just be honest with yourself and do it. Because if it gets you towards your goal, who cares?
Yeah, whatever works at this point. Just do whatever works. It doesn't matter if you're like, I can't believe I care about this electronic tree dying, but I do.
Who cares? I know.
So I'm going to keep working another 10 minutes.
Yep, you do you. Another thing that they talk about in the habit world that I think can be really effective is this idea of stacking habits. So if you want to do something different, you pick a habit that you already have and add to it. A common explanation of this is, I want to meditate for 5 minutes a day, but I'm having trouble doing that. So instead, you're going to say, well, I do brush my teeth at 8 o'clock in the morning every day. So as soon as I brush my teeth, I'm going to meditate because I already have a habit of brushing my teeth. And I think you can do this with your bar study. I think spaced repetition is something that's ripe for this. You could do the same sort of thing where you say, I'm going to eat breakfast and then I'm going to do my 10 minutes of spaced repetition. And then you're not really having to remember to do the spaced repetition. You're just eating breakfast, which most of us will do every morning. So It feels less onerous because you're not really adding a task. It's not something new. You're just kind of adding on a little snack to whatever else you were already doing.
I mean, most people are having like a coffee or tea in the morning. And oftentimes I'll do something like that. I'll be like, well, when I'm having my tea, which takes me maybe 5 minutes to drink, if I'm drinking it slowly, I will also do this other thing. So it might be, Duolingo. It might be spaced repetition. It might be meditating. But I'm already going to have the tea. I never miss that.
Right, exactly. So it's great because it makes it a no-brainer to add something into your day. And I think the last thing I wanted to make sure that I mentioned was this idea of showing yourself compassion, because it can be really hard to change your habits and be honest with yourself about what's working and what's not working. And it's such an important thing to remember that if at first you don't succeed, you just have to try again tomorrow.
Right. At least you tried. I mean, that's the way I look at any of this stuff. If I'm teaching skiing and I have somebody do something and they fall down and they're upset, I'm like, hey, you tried it. It didn't work that time, but at least you gave it a shot. You have to do that if you're going to learn. And it's the same thing here. You have to give it a shot, whether it is building a new habit. You can't just build that conceptually. You have to do it. And the same thing with bar study. You have to do these things that you don't particularly want to do necessarily, because that's what's going to get you to the point you need to be at. And that's hard. And I think having compassion for yourself and for the project is really important, because it is a difficult project and there will be down days. Things will go well and things will not go well. And that's just how it is.
Yeah. I think the more I look at the world and watch different people make different choices in their lives, this idea of how to move past just being stuck, being frustrated, doing the hard thing, getting out of a situation that doesn't feel like it's serving you, changing your study habits because you realize that listening to lectures is only getting you 59% of retention. Whatever it is, it takes a lot of courage and, like Adam Grant was saying, bravery to do these hard things. But there can be some pretty amazing things that happen once you are willing to go to that uncomfortable place and try something new.
Yeah, and I can even see if you're feeling really bad about the MBE, it's like, okay, today I'm going to do one question. And then tomorrow I'm going to do 2 questions. And the next day I'm going to do 3 questions. And you might feel like, oh my God, that's nothing. Are you crazy? That wouldn't get me anywhere. But by the end of the week, you've already done way more than you've done when you're doing 0.
Yeah. Or if you added a question a day, by the end of a month, you're doing 30 question sets.
Exactly. That's where you need to be. That's all we ask.
Yeah, exactly. But that's that cumulative effect. You just have to be willing to take these steps and be methodical about it. It doesn't always feel amazing. Your 10 minutes of spaced repetition doesn't feel like you did anything amazing, but you just have to trust in the process.
Yeah, I think that's really the key. Figure out what's working for you and do more of it, and then trust that it's going to be enough in the end and that you can take time off and you don't have to study 14 hours a day. This is not what you need to be doing.
Yeah. Well, I think with that, we're about out of time. Alison, any final thoughts?
No, I think honestly, the compassion piece and the bravery is really what I come back to. I feel like Brene Brown right now, but
I know,
another one of our
right?
favorites. And one of the things she says is like, I want to be the man in the ring, not the person doing the critique. You've got to get in there and like fight the exam if you're going to pass it. You can't just like think about it. You can't just plan things and then not do them because they don't feel great. You've got to get in there and really wrestle with this stuff.
Yeah. And it's hard to put yourself out there and to risk failure.
Yeah, true.
And that is bravery. I think that is a brave thing to do, is to try and risk failure. But you won't win. You won't pass. You won't be able to put this behind yourself if you don't just stick your neck out, do your best.
Yeah, exactly. It's like take that deep breath and be like, all right, I'm going to go for it.
Yeah, exactly. Well, if you enjoyed this episode of the Bar Exam Toolbox podcast, please take a second to leave a review and rating on your favorite listening app. We'd really appreciate it, and be sure to subscribe so you don't miss anything. If you're still in law school, you might also like to check out our popular Law School Toolbox podcast as well. If you have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to reach out to myself or Alison at lee@barexamtoolbox.com or Alison@barexamtoolbox.com, or you can always contact us via our website contact form at barexamtoolbox.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk soon.